Chapter 4 The Flood. No one could think of anything else to do for the garden, not even Mathew Maria. Night came, and they still hadn't thought of anything. "Perhaps we will think of it in the morning," said Mr. Martin, and they all went to bed. Melanie and Mary went into their canopy beds with their favorite doll and stuffed elephant. Maura and Mia climbed into their bunk beds as their music box played a soft tune, and Mathew Maria climbed into her rocket ship with one of her favorite books. Mr. and Mrs. Martin walked from room to room, tucking them in, before climbing into their waterbed. Everyone went to sleep. While they slept, it began to rain. The clock was just striking 12 when Mathew Maria awoke again. She could hear the sound of falling water. It was a very soothing sound, like a distant waterfall. "I'm thirsty," she said, and she climbed out of the rocket ship to go get a glass of water. She opened her door, stepped into the hall, and discovered that the hallway had become a river. The water wasn't just falling outside, it was falling straight through the hole in the roof that Mr. Martin had cut. It fell down upon his garden, ran down the stairs, and was rushing down the hall. "Oh no," said Mathew Maria. "Suppose it gets too high and sweeps us all away. If only I had a boat." Already the river of water had swept into her room. As Mathew Maria was very small, it would only take a little bit of rushing water to sweep her away. But she was also a very smart little girl, so she climbed back onto her rocket ship bed, which dangled high above the water, and began to think. And when she saw her shoes floating away in the water and out of the door, she suddenly had an idea. She still had some of the bubbles from her mother's bubble machine, the ones that never go pop. She knew that they floated on top of water because she had seen them bouncing into the sink. "If I glue them to the bottom of my shoes," she said, "I can walk on top of the water. But how can I reach them?" For her bubbles were inside the top drawer of her dresser. To get to her dresser, she would have to cross the water. But still, she was a very smart girl, and she soon saw a way. First, she pulled the sheets from her bed and twisted them into a rope. Then she began to rock her bed. Because it was hanging from the ceiling on chains, it swung back and forth. It could not swing very far, but it was just far enough that she could reach her bookshelf. Finally, she leapt from her bed and landed right on the middle shelf. "It's a good thing it's an extra strong bookshelf," she said, "and it is bolted to the wall. Otherwise it would break or fall, and that would hurt." But it was very strong and bolted to the wall, so it did not break or fall like most bookcases might. She climbed the bookshelf just like a ladder until she reached the top. Then she took a rope of sheets. She made a loop like a lasso. Before her, a few feet away, was a fan. Her plan was to lasso the fan blades and swing upon it across the room onto her dresser. Now, normally, she knew that it was not a good idea to swing on a fan. A fan is very large, but, like most bookcases, it might not be very strong. Even her light weight could make it come crashing down. But Mathew Maria also knew that her mother and father were always worried about safety. That is why her bookcase was strong enough to hold her up. And that is why every ceiling fan in the house was made to be extra, extra strong. So she twisted up her sheets into a rope, made a loop, and took aim. A fan is a very hard thing to lasso with bed sheets. And all the while the water still rushed across the floor, rising and rising. The first time she tossed her lasso, she missed. The second time she missed, but she kept trying, and each time her aim got better. Finally, the loop caught a blade, and she pulled it tight. Taking a deep breath, she leapt from her bookcase and went swinging through the air. The fan began to spin around and around as she swung, and Mathew Maria went around and around, holding on tight. Finally, she let go and went flying through the air. She landed right on top of her dresser. "And now for the bubbles," she said, and she pulled open the top drawer. She found socks and some pennies and a peppermint and some seeds, and finally, in the very back corner, 3 bubbles. "But now I need glue," she said. Luckily, she had some extra special super glue sitting on top of her dresser, but she had no shoes to glue the bubbles to. "I can use my socks then," she decided, and she glued 2 bubbles right on the bottom of her socks. Now ready to face the flood, she climbed off her dresser and stepped onto the water. The water had risen almost as high as she was tall, but with her bubble socks she was able to stay above the water. It was not very easy to keep her balance, but in the end she managed, and she skated out of her room and into the hallway. She went to each bedroom and opened the door, calling, "Wake up! Wake up! There is a flood!" She carried with her the extra special superglue so that her sisters could use their own bubbles to make bubble socks and follow her. Soon Melanie, Maura, Mia, and Mary were all skating after her down the hall into their parents' room. "Wake up! Wake up!" they all cried. "There is a flood!" "Goodness," said Mr. Martin as he sat up. "My water bed is under water." For the water had just risen up higher than the bed. Then Mr. Martin and Mrs. Martin went wading through the water, while their 5 children skated above it until they reached the elevator. But the water had risen so high it covered the entrance to the elevator, and the staircase had become a great waterfall with the rain pouring in over it. "I know," said Mathew Maria. "We can use the bubble socks to bounce to the 2nd floor, if we are allowed," for Mrs. Martin had forbidden using the bubbles to bounce with. "Yes," said Mrs. Martin, "we can do that, if you pass your bubbles back down to us once you are up," for only the children had bubble socks to bounce with. Then all the children began to bounce, and they found they could bounce just as easily on top of water as on land, and soon they all landed on the 2nd floor where it was still dry. Then they dropped their socks down to their parents. Because their feet weren't small enough to wear their daughters' socks, they had to wear them on their hands, and bounce while standing on their heads. Finally, they were all safe above the flood. "Goodness," said Mr. Martin, "who knew that skylights were so much trouble?" And they all went to sleep in the living room for the rest of the night.